Howdy folks, today we're going to be talking about gum bichromate. And if you're wondering what that is, well, you're not alone. Luckily, we've got experts in analog photography on the show today, so all shall be revealed right after this. Welcome to Camera Shake, where we bring you the insider scoop on all things photography and videography, giving you a unique opportunity to stay ahead of the curve. We spent literally hundreds of hours interviewing some of the most renowned photographers of our time, giving you access to knowledge and expertise that's not available anywhere else. As always, I'm your host, Kirsten Nutz, and if you enjoy this content, consider lending your support to buymeacoffee.com/camerashake to help us create more exciting episodes for you. Your support really does make a difference. But without further ado, let's give it up for today's special guest, analog photographer, the founder of the Bushwick Community Darkroom in New York City, Shim, I hope I pronounced this right, Shim Photo at the United Lab Network. Give it up for LUCIA ROLLOW. LUCIA, how are you?
I'm pretty good. How are you?
Oops, and I pressed the wrong buttons, and now you're on screen.
Oops.
How are you?
I'm okay.
Fantastic. It's an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. We've talked about analog photography or film photography on the show in the past. In particular, I remember a few months ago we had a guest on the show called Gilbert Mayak, who is a street photographer in London in the UK. And he shoots a lot on film, which was super interesting. And for me, having grown up in the sort of digital age, as it were, for me, film photography has always been, it's been sort of a mystery because actually, as a kid, I grew up around film photography. My dad and my grandmother were both photographers. And I remember, my dad turning our bathroom into a dark room and, nobody was allowed in and all that kind of jazz.
Of course.
Of course. But give us sort of a helicopter view about who you are and what your particular affiliation with analog photography is.
My name's Lucia, right? I grew up in Boston, Massachusetts. And my parents were both sort of, artistically inclined, but not so much in a way that it was like their day jobs, right? My dad wrote computer manuals and my mom has a bunch of real estate, so she manages the real estate and whatnot. But it was always like we grew up in this like liberal arts New England household, so there was a lot of art and art history surrounding us. And when I was like, I don't even know, probably like 4 or 5, one of my parents' friends gave me one of those 110 cameras that are those little skinny ones.
I remember that type of camera because I grew up, I remember a camera that my dad had, I think. It was called, I'm not really sure what it was called. It was an Agfa, I seem to remember. And it looked exactly the same.
That sounds right, yeah.
It had like a big red button. And then in order to forward the film, you'd basically ratchet it together, it would be like, it'd be this super cool sound. And I remember this, as a kid just sitting there, just listening to that sound. It's like the most perfect kind of Star Wars-like, Foley sound.
Right? It's like super satisfying. So, yeah. I was basically hooked after I got that. And then I went to a summer camp when I was like about 12 or 13, I think, and got into a dark room there. And then from there, that just kind of like set me on the road of like, oh, like this is like my sort of like safe space where I can just, be here, like being productive, but also like doing stuff and like being productive, but also having fun. And my dad was like, sort of a painter. And so he was always trying to get us to draw and stuff. And I was never about that. I can't translate from my eyes to my hand, but with the camera, it felt like I could. So, I like spent a lot of time in the darkroom in high school, and then I came to New York to study at the School of Visual Arts. I studied photography there, and then I graduated, and a few years later, I started the darkroom because I needed a darkroom, basically. And I had these shared community darkrooms from school for the last like decade prior to that, and so I was like, I miss this like camaraderie of having people around me and like being able to talk to them and being able to bounce ideas off of them, but not necessarily feeling like obligated, like we could all kind of do our own thing, but also, if people were there. So if you wanted them, you could like reach them. But it's a good like environment, I feel like, for introverts who still want like a little bit of socializing or something.
Yeah.
And I picked up gum printing while I was in high school. So
yeah, I mean, gum printing, I'll be honest with you, I'd never even heard of that. So that's a really interesting thing. But before we get into that in more detail, because I will definitely I'll pick that. That's going to be super interesting. Taking photographs or making photographs is sort of a two-part process. There's the taking of the picture, and then there's the kind of bringing it to life in a digital form, in post-processing, or of course in an analog form in the darkroom. Have you been sort of drawn to the process in the darkroom more than the taking of the picture, or how was that for you?
I'm sort of inclined to say like yes overall. If you had to like boil it down like that simply, but I don't know. I mean, I think of like film and digital as like just they're very different and they serve very different purposes for me. Like I do shoot digitally sometimes, like I've been known to do, headshots and portraits and events and stuff. Just like, to pay the bills and whatnot. Cause I do know how to like, take a picture. But it's more something for me where I'm like, that's just like, I kind of turn off my brain and am doing a job. Right. But when I'm shooting film, I'm definitely like more like sort of thoughtful about the actual picture that I'm taking. And I use completely different cameras, so like the experience of actually taking a picture is still definitely part of the process. I have a Hasselblad, so I love that thing, right? Like, I mean, that's a very different experience to shoot a Hasselblad than it is to shoot like most other cameras. And so like that part of the taking, like, I definitely enjoy it. It's definitely like a major part of the process for me, but it's so quick, that, yeah, I'm not here to just like scan my negatives and print them out on inkjet paper or whatever. For me, the whole process is the thing that like has the sort of enjoyment, satisfaction, and reward.
There's a definite, a real satisfaction in like shooting with like mechanical cameras. That's why I find, the thing about shooting digital for me is always that it's basically, it's almost like just a computational thing. There isn't really very much of a satisfaction. You click a button, it hardly makes any noise at all. You can't feel anything. There's no haptic kind of response or anything like that. There's nothing, you don't put a film in. It's just, it's almost like, I mean, you whip out your phone, almost, you whip out your phone, you take a picture, and you're gone. That's basically that. And then also you have the instant gratification of being able to look at the shot immediately on the back of the camera, and and make adjustments from there. And that has advantages, of course it does. But
absolutely,
the thing that always fascinated me when I was a kid, and I watched my dad in the darkroom, was that there was sort of there was an element of secrecy and mystery about it, because you didn't know what the image was going to be, and then you stand there, you look at the tray, and it would just all of a sudden appear,
right?
And that'd be the first time.
There's nothing like that. There's absolutely nothing like that.
It's a really satisfying experience, and I think to be honest with you, I mean, although I grew up around film photographers. At the time, back in the 80s or something, mid 80s, I kind of felt everybody's shooting stills around me. I'm going to go into video because I want to make movies,
Oh, yeah.
And I went. I was also
that would
something
be very expensive to shoot on film.
Yeah. That being said, my granddad used to shoot Super 8 films, 8mm films. So it's no sound, just picture. That was real. So that was one of the things in my family. Every other Sunday or something, we'd have to sit in a darkened room with a projector and watch his latest creation, which was basically just family stuff.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I mean, but there was something to it. There was something about the screen going on, the projector coming out, and then the sound of the projector, the the light beam.
Right. Like people used to do slideshows of just like still slides from their vacations.
Yeah, exactly.
I remember being like very little, and my parents used to do that. Like we went to Europe a few times when I was like a baby, and when we came home, they would set up the slide projector in the living room and invite a bunch of friends over and sit there and like the whirring and flicking and like
yeah, exactly. And of course, in those days, I mean, you know, you wouldn't really find it nowadays, but in those days, people used to smoke a lot more. So I remember sitting there, you know, as a kid,
right.
and you know, and there'd be like, you know, a smoke-filled room, like the light beam of the projector, and then, you know, everything happening on the screen. And everything was like, I don't know, 8 frames per second or something. Everything was a bit... all the movements were a bit not very smooth. But it had something to it. And I think, you know, for me, it was definitely something that hooked me into the world of, you know, of image creation and stuff like that. For me personally, when I eventually went into photography proper, the world had already switched to digital. It was really kind of at the point when everything was switching, and so at that time, I kind of thought, "Oh, this sounds good. Well, I don't have to like sit in a room with chemicals." Awesome,
great. Sit in front of a computer.
I know, and it's, you know, and it's the thing. Like sometimes, not sometimes, actually quite often, you know, I'm thinking, God, it would be cool actually to, you know, to work in a darkroom. Now, you've obviously, you went, you know, you studied photography, and then film photography, analog photography just stuck with you. What was the thing that sort of that you know, that was the word that kept on fascinating you about analog photography when the world around you just moved on to digital?
Interesting, because like as much as like the world moved on to digital, like sort of from my perspective, that was actually like a fleeting drop in the pan. And so there was never really any need for me to move on from digital, if that makes any sense. Like I graduated from college in 2009, and Kodak first or second or whatever declared bankruptcy in like 2011 or 2012, I think. And so, and then my SVA, my college, got rid of their color darkroom around the same time. And I think now they've gotten rid of about half of their black and white darkrooms as well. So it felt like I was sort of part of this like last generation that was like being taught this stuff as like, you need to know how to take a studio portrait on 4x5 or you won't be able to have a career, right? And I feel like the kids that started school maybe like my senior year or right after I graduated, I don't think they like got that kind of education. I think they were focused a lot more on digital. But I mean, for me, it wasn't that it was the only thing I ever knew. It was just that like I knew immediately that I didn't want to spend my life sitting in front of a computer and like editing photos. And I always hated just doing all of that Photoshop stuff. And I was like, this is not why I got into photography. I got into photography because I like the tactile and the mystery and the science and the magic and like all of that stuff. And I felt like the computers just totally like sucked the soul out of it, shall we say, right? And then after Kodak went bankrupt, it sort of seemed like things started turning around. And now you look at it and like Gen Z is all about film. And I'm like, what? So, but also like in addition to that, you know, I have a lot of friends that are like professional editorial photographers, fashion photographers, just generally commercial photographers. And when I was in school in, you know, the early 2000s, all of that stuff was being shot on film. And I was doing a lot of, I had several jobs at magazines as like an assistant photo editor. And so I could see all of that stuff back then being shot on film too. You know, we were handling all these medium format, like large format negatives that were, it was just the only way to get the quality that was high enough for print, you know, especially in the early 2000s, digital cameras still just weren't, they weren't where they are now, for sure. Obviously, it's been 20 years, but so yeah. And now I look at like the next generation of people who are now my peers who are doing those same kinds of shoots, and a lot of them are shooting film, like a lot. It's really shocking the number of people to me that are actually like shooting, developing, and then a lot of especially for fashion, people will make prints in the color darkroom and then scan those prints and use that as their sort of like color reference for doing the digital stuff. And so I think it's really interesting how they've sort of like learned to like play together. And yeah, I mean, like, am I answering your question? For me, digital is good for the like kind of quick stuff, but I feel like for the things that we need to last, those like might always be shot on film, you know, because I mean, when you boil it down at the end of the day, the film is the only archival like option that we have for images, you know, your hard drives, your CDs, your magnetic videotape or whatever, that's all going to just degrade and disappear over the course of maybe a decade. But if your film is stored properly, it'll last forever, right? I mean, we've still got some of the like first negatives. So that's a big part of it for me too. It's just like, if I care about this, if I'm going to put the energy into making this, then why am I going to do it in such a way that like the file's just going to disappear and be deleted and it's going to be like it never existed? Or I'm going to have like an inkjet print that like may or may not be archival. And like, so yeah, I don't know. A huge portion of it for me is the archivability.
Often it's, you know, people think, well, you know, it's a digital file, so I could just, you know, save it in the cloud or, you know, save it in a hard drive or whatever, and it'll be there forever.
Right. But make copies of it.
Yeah. But then, of course, you know, that's not really how it works. You know, I remember not too long ago, actually, you know, again, it's something I've spoken about on this podcast several times. But I remember not too long ago, my mom found, so my mom lives in the south of Germany. She found a shoebox in the basement of 8mm videotapes, like Video 8 tapes that I had shot back in the sort of late 80s, early 90s, you know, when I was like, basically, I had a one of the first of digital video cameras that you could get at the time. And I lived with that thing. I mean, I basically shot everything, you know, the most boring stuff. I mean, it's stuff so boring you wouldn't even. I mean, you know, my parents playing tennis.
You know, then you look back on it and it's like, you know, nostalgic and like that. It is. I don't know. I feel like it doesn't matter what it is. Like
100%, it's absolutely nostalgic, especially now, you know, that my dad isn't around anymore, and it's like, well, okay, I can't believe how young they were back then. But when she sent those tapes back to me, and I, you know, first of all, I had to figure out a way of digitizing that, because it's, you know, it was magnetic tape, you know, and I didn't have a camcorder that could handle that format. And by sheer chance, a client of mine called me up and she's like, oh, well, moving house, and you know, I've got this, like my dad's camcorder in the basement, and I was going to throw it out, but then I thought maybe you might want it. Yeah, do you want to have a look at it? And I'm like, yeah, sure, absolutely, 100%. So I went and I got it, and it was basically pretty much brand new. It's a Sony Handycam Video 8mm magnetic tape film, you know. And so I'm like, ooh, okay, cool. I wonder if these tapes work. And so I managed to basically transfer those from the camcorder onto my computer. But I'd say about 65% of it had degraded to the point where you either had only audio left, or like, you know, the image was completely falling apart. So I think probably about 65% of it was unusable. The rest of it was pretty okay, you know. But it just goes to show, this is like, you know, these tapes are how old? 30 years old, I guess. You know, and that's really no time.
Yeah, and they already, right, exactly. And I mean, if people are shooting editorial stuff and like, you know, stuff that's like important news stuff, you know, I mean, we have like those pictures from D-Day that like Robert Capa shot. Like if he had shot that digitally, like would we have any of those pictures, you know? Like, I mean, it's not that it's like good, but we need that stuff documented, and like future generations need to be able to see that stuff. And so, I mean, there's definitely a part of me that's like concerned about, you know, the quantity of history that we're gonna lose over the next
totally
years or whatever. But
it is so easy to lose as well. My mom moved house last year, and there were boxes and boxes and boxes of photographs of prints. I mean, I don't know, thousands of prints going all the way back to, I don't know, I guess the early 20th century, I think, something like that.
Wow.
You know, family photos and God knows what. I mean, I didn't recognize, you know.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing was these prints were still there in the box, and most of them were actually still really good, especially the black and white ones. Some of the color ones, you know, obviously not so much, but, you know, but they were still there. Now, I remember shooting or photographing my daughter ever since she was born. She's 12 now. And I have absolutely zero idea where those initial images were. They were shot on like an iPhone 4, but I have no idea where those images are. I mean, they're somewhere probably on some hard drive or in the cloud or something. But, you know, no idea. There's absolutely no way.
They're not in a shoebox under your bed.
They're not in a shoebox, exactly. And so, you know, so actually, for all intents and purposes, they're actually lost.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, like, I mean, like when Facebook came out first, right? Everybody was like really excited about it. We were all creating these photo albums and putting them on Facebook and all that stuff. And it's like, how much of that stuff like only went on Facebook, right? Like it's probably still buried somewhere in your Facebook album or whatever, if you still have that. But like, you know, those, I mean, a lot of that stuff is just like quick iPhone photos, right? And so we have all of these like archives and like, we don't even like own that shit. I don't even know how those laws work. Like,
and what if Facebook goes out of business tomorrow and it's all gone?
Right,
and then
exactly.
What?
They could just shut down their servers and then we just don't have access to any of our personal like history because we didn't think that we needed to back them up and print them out and whatever. Whereas if you shoot a negative, you just have a negative and then you can print it endlessly for the rest of time.
Exactly.
And you don't have to worry about the quality decreasing. And like, that's the other thing too with like digital files is like they kind of degrade over time too. So even if you still have your hard drive or whatever, like eventually those files are gonna, I don't know, disintegrate. I don't know what the word would be, but like people explained it to me who know about these things, but I don't know enough about these things to explain it myself. Sorry.
Hey, let me just jump in real quick to tell you about the amazing sponsor of this episode, Platypod. Platypod offers innovative camera support systems designed to unleash your creativity. With their stable, versatile, and portable solutions, you can capture stunning shots like never before. And I'm not just saying that. As the host of the Camera Shake podcast, I can personally vouch for Platypod's incredible products. They've become an integral part of the show. In fact, I'm surrounded by various Platypod products holding up lights, cameras, microphones, and so on. It's really helped to transform the way I make the show and the way I shoot at home, in the studio, and on location. But don't just take my word for it. Explore Platypod's website at www.platypod.com to discover their range of products, including the Platypod Extreme, Platypod tripod heads, and the brand new handle, of course. Make sure to follow Platypod on Instagram and Facebook at Platypod Tripods for exclusive updates, tips, and giveaways. By choosing Platypod, you're not only investing in your photography, but you're also supporting the Camera Shake Photography Podcast. Thanks again to Platypod, our amazing sponsor. Platypod, where innovation never sleeps. If you could take us through, first of all, the basic process of developing film, just for those of our listeners who may have grown up in a entirely digital world, but I know there's lots of people out there who are interested and curious about analog photography. What's the actual basic process from taking the image to holding the finished print in your hands, in sort of a standard development kind of way?
That's such a good question. It's amazing, like doing the film developing at the darkroom and stuff, the number of people that like just don't have any idea. And I'm always like, wait, oh, what? Like, so it's like really a 3-step process. And it's developing and it's printing. And those are two different things and they're two different steps. And when people come to me and ask to get their film developed, sometimes they get angry because I don't give them prints because they haven't asked for prints. They only asked for developing. So developing is taking the film. It's the process of taking the film from being something that can only be contained in that metal canister that you put in your camera and turning it into something that can be looked at in white daylight and you can actually like see an image. Like if you pulled the film out of the canister, after you exposed it, but before you developed it, you wouldn't be able to see anything. It would just be, gray or brown, depending on if it's color film. And this is actually something people sometimes ask me. They'll say, I found this old roll. Is there any way that I can look at it and see if it's been shot or not before I develop it? And I'm like, no, like there just isn't. Like it looks exactly the same before and after exposure until you develop it. And so then you develop it, and that is a process of loading the film either into a tank or a machine and running it through 3 chemicals. Developer, which brings up the image. Stop, which stops the image from continuing to develop. And fixer, which makes it safe to bring out into the white light for all practical purposes. And those are the same chemicals that are used in printing, but like slightly different versions and dilutions. So yeah, if you're doing it at home, you just load the film into a tank and like pour the chemicals into the tank and shake it around for, usually around 10 minutes and dump it out and whatever. And then you hang it up to dry. And then once you have the negative, that's what the developed film is called, the negative, right? You take the negative and you put it in an enlarger. And an enlarger is really just a projector that is pointed down instead of at a wall. But there are some enlargers that point at the wall, actually. If you want to make big prints, you can project onto the wall. So yeah, you put the negative in the enlarger, you project it down or out onto a surface, and then you have a piece of light-sensitive paper, and you put that under the projection. And that, the clear parts of the negative cause the white parts of the paper to turn black, and the black parts of the negative cause the white parts of the paper to stay light. And so where you have had a negative image on a piece of film, you end up with a positive image on a piece of paper. And you can't see that positive image on the piece of paper until you start running it through the chemicals. And so in a black and white darkroom, that's usually just done in trays with developer, stop, fixer. And with color, it's usually done in a machine with a developer and a bleach. It's a little different. It's not really complicated. It's just kind of more gross. So yeah, in order to get the print, in order to get the paper, you have to, the printing and the developing are different things, basically, is my point there.
So you specialize in a process called gum bichromate, which is a completely different process. Take us through how that works.
It's not actually completely different. It's pretty, where do I start with that? There are a bunch of different ways that people do it, but the way that I do it, I start with black and white negatives. And then there's this, you can buy lith film is what it's called. Lithography film, I think, is what it's like designed for. And it's a high contrast plastic that has an emulsion painted on one side, and it comes in sheets. So it's, instead of being a little roll that's like an inch wide, like most 35 millimeter rolls are, the lith film is, I usually use sheets that are about 9 by 12, but you can get it as big as like 20 by 24, and maybe in rolls too. I'm not sure exactly how big it gets, but that doesn't matter. So when I do my gum prints, I do the first half of the process there that I just explained with the developing. And I take the picture in a regular camera, and then when I start printing, instead of printing down onto paper, I first print onto this plastic stuff, the big sheets of lith film. And from that, I create basically a large negative, like a contact negative that I can put on directly on a piece of paper, and that will make my image, instead of putting my negative in an enlarger and projecting it down onto a piece of paper. Because when you're doing gum bichromate, you're using dichromate as the light sensitive material, and it's only sensitive to ultraviolet light, sunlight. So you can't make an exposure of a gum print using an enlarger. You have to do it either outside in the sun or with special UV lights. So you need the negative to go directly on the paper. Once you have your big negative, you mix up your photographic emulsion for the actual print. And that's just a mixture of potassium dichromate, gum arabic, and any color watercolor pigment. And you just take those three ingredients in, various ratios depending on the amount of contrast you want. And you coat it on the paper, and you make your print by putting the piece of plastic on top of it and putting it out in the sun. And then it develops in water. And the clear parts of the negative have caused the dichromate to harden and glue the pigment to the paper, and the black parts of the negative have left the dichromate soft, so those kind of just like dissolve, and you end up with a positive image because you used a negative, and it ends up being sort of a very like painterly watercolor-esque representation of a photograph.
Yeah, I was going to say the end results really differ very dramatically from like a standard print. They really have this sort of this kind of painterly quality to them, which makes them immediately super interesting. And I always thought, for some reason, I always thought this was a fairly in inverted commas, a relatively modern process, but it's not. It's actually something that was developed relatively early on.
I think dichromate has been around for a while. Yeah. I mean, I know that people have been using dichromates of various sorts. There's ammonium dichromate and potassium dichromate, and there are probably others. But I know that people have been using those as like sensitizing materials for, I don't know, at least 100 years, probably more like 200 years. Like, yeah. It's definitely one of the older processes. It's not like the oldest, right? It's not like salt printing or whatever, but and I'm not sure exactly when it was invented or discovered, but I would estimate sometime in the 1800s.
Yeah, it's super interesting. I mean, it's I find it very, very satisfying to see that those processes are still used and are still relevant. Even today, even with like I don't know 100 megapixel digital files.
Right. I mean, I think this is part of like the sort of like backlash to digital almost, like given the simplicity and the speed that we can accomplish with digital, it sort of makes some people want to, step back and slow down a bit more, because I mean, making a gum print is going to take basically at least a week, because you have to do multiple layers of color, and you have to let the paper completely dry overnight between the multiple layers, and making the negatives and taking the picture. And if you did everything, immediately one after the other, you could probably make a print in about a week. It usually takes me about a month.
Oh, wow. That's incredible.
I take days off in between.
Yeah, that's incredible. So,
it's nice though, right? It forces you to slow down.
I remember a little while ago, I was sort of a onlooker at a photography at a photo competition, and one of the images was really interesting. It's basically it was a bunch of people. You could make them out as people. It's basically a street scene. It looked like it was shot through a window that had water running down on it, and so you could make out that there were people. And it was a really, really cool image. And my first, obviously, my first instinct was like, Photoshop. And then, but it turned out that actually that was shot completely analog through multiple stages with, there was multiple different stages in rephotographing and redeveloping, blah, blah, the whole thing took a week, to put this thing together. And immediately you have a completely different form of respect for that image, because, what previously I thought was like, oh yeah, Photoshop filter, no problem. They don't all of a sudden turn into, whoa, this is how it works, man, unbelievable. And what fascinates me with that is the the foresight required in actually creating that, because you really, you're creating something really at the creation stage rather than later on in post processing. So a lot of the work that I do, which is a lot of the times composites, I'll shoot for the composites, so I'd know what I need for the post processing part of it. And so I have the final image in mind, and then that is just a technical putting it together on a computer type of a thing, but it's in no way as, I mean, it doesn't take a week, let's put it this way.
It just takes like 9 hours of staring at a computer screen.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it's, and it's, of course, it's a completely different process. But yeah, I mean, personally, I've always been fascinated by the actuals, the analogness. And it's like you said, it's almost like a reaction, like a pushing back against that sort of ever encroaching digital world, because everything's going digital and everything's, everything nowadays for some reason requires this sort of instant gratification, like being able to see the photo on the back of your camera, for example, and I mean, I've been asked, like, what's your ultimate nightmare in photography? And I always say shooting a wedding on film. For me, like, it's because I'd be dead scared, like, oh man, if anybody ever asked me, like,
I wouldn't do that. Like,
yeah, it's shocking, and yet people used to do it every day, like, so, I mean, if I guess on the show,
still do it, and they charge a premium for it. It's like a high-end luxury thing now to get your wedding shot on film, which, I mean, it should be given the cost of film and developing and all that stuff. But it's like, yeah. I would not be able to stand that pressure, honestly.
It's humongous pressure. Can you imagine? Like, did you get the first kiss?
Well,
I hope so. I don't know.
Right.
Yeah. But they're also, I mean, they're really the creative avenues in that. I fairly recently got into Instax photography, so it doesn't really have anything to do with film development. I mean, maybe in a little way. But the thing about that, the thing about that is what I like about it is the fact that you press the shutter button and then that is it. There's no, there's no post-processing or anything. It's basically that is the moment that you captured right there, and there's no fiddling about with it afterwards. It's very, very satisfying to have something physical in your hand. And I think just like a lot of digital photographers in the beginning, when I went into photography, I never really saw the point of having a physical photograph in your hand.
Of printing it.
Yeah, of printing, yeah. But I've learned that through experience, is that it's incredibly satisfying to have a hard copy version of the fact that thing that you created doesn't just exist on a screen behind glass or somewhere as a digital file of zeros and ones, but it's actually a physical thing. That's incredibly satisfying.
Right. And having like being able to, understand sort of the like magic and science that like went into making that image like show up on the paper, and like being in the darkroom and having a hand and feeling some sort of sense of semi-control over like the results of that image. I think that is like really empowering. It's amazing to see like, I don't know, kids respond to this stuff. There's a traveling darkroom that's I think they're based in Turkey, and they're called the Circane Darkroom. And I've been sort of vaguely in touch with them for, I don't even know, like probably at least 5 years now. And they give just like little cameras to like Syrian refugee children, and then they teach them how to develop and print in this like RV thing that they drive around. And I'm just like,
awesome.
It's amazing to see these pictures that these kids take, because they're just, running around in these fields and playing and being like normal, happy children. And like, then they're going and learning how to do this. And I just feel like it makes me really happy that something like that can be available in, a place like that where, shit kind of sucks most of the time, I imagine, for these kids because they're refugee children.
Absolutely. Which brings me to the Bushwick Community Darkroom that you set up some years ago. I want to talk about that because when I read about that, I kind of thought, man, that would be so cool if anything like that existed where I am. I'm on the outskirts of London, and I mean, there may be a community darkroom in London. I don't actually know. It's such a good idea. There must be. I'm sure there would be, which I will seek out after this. But tell us a little bit about the Bushwick Community Darkroom. How did you come up with that idea, and how did you make that happen?
I mean, I was living in Bushwick, and it was like a few years after I graduated from school. We were still sort of in the recovery from the economic collapse or whatever of 2008. And so, you know, it sort of just felt like a weird time, and I couldn't really find a job that I wanted. I thought I was going to go be a photo editor after I graduated, but then all the magazines closed. So I was sort of like in this limbo of like, what am I doing? What do I want to do? And yeah, I mean, I tried to use a few other like public darkrooms in New York City, and either they were just like way beyond my price range, or they weren't like reliable or whatever. There, I wanted a place that like I could just get to easily and whenever I wanted. Basically, I'm spoiled. But then I found out that they had these basically like 6 foot by 8 foot, maybe 8 by 10 foot storage units in the basement of the building that I was living in. And the one that was actually available at that moment was the one that was right next to the laundry room. So I was like, hey, like all I really needed at that moment in time was a black and white darkroom, and I wanted to be able to print up to 16 by 20. So I was like, okay, can I do this in this space? What do I need to do to make this happen? And, you know, I sort of figured out that like it wouldn't actually be very hard because nobody, like there's so much darkroom equipment just out there. It's so easy to just get like for like virtually no money, right? So, and then I started talking to a few of my friends, and I was involved in a couple different like arts organizations in the neighborhood at the time. So I started talking to people there and being like, if I set this up as like a community darkroom, is it something that you would be interested in? Whatever. I got, so, you know, some pretty good feedback. So I launched a Kickstarter, and we reached the Kickstarter goal. I didn't really think we were going to reach the Kickstarter goal. So when we did, I was kind of like, oh, fuck, now I actually have to do this. But yeah, then I did it, and I set it up in this closet, and we were down there for, I don't know, a year and a half or 2 years. And it got to the point where it was just like fully at capacity all the time. And I was like, well, shit, I need to like, you know, find some more space. Cause I was also like, as the word gets out, more people start offering you equipment. And so I ended up with like 10 enlargers for my little closet. And I was like, this isn't working, I need more space. Yeah. And so from there, we just kind of moved into bigger and bigger spaces. And then in 2015, we moved into a 4,000 square foot warehouse that was a few blocks from the original closet. And then we just moved out of that space at the end of last year because it was falling down and flooding and didn't have heat or air conditioning. And I just got to a point where I was like, I can't spend another winter here. And I thought I had another space lined up that we were going to move into last March. And then like a week before we were supposed to move in there, that landlord like just totally flipped the script on me. And he was like, I'm not comfortable with this. And I was like, okay, I've been giving you all the information you've been asking for as you've been asking for it. Like I told you this was going to be a dark room. I don't know like what part of this you're not comfortable with, but you know, his reaction was just so like extra that I just was like, I'm not going to engage with this guy. And so since then I've sort of been like in limbo looking for a new place to put the dark room, and everything is in storage right now. But I have a couple of leads I'm like working on, you know, figuring out the details of, and it's just been like a super hectic summer. My mom got diagnosed with cancer and all this various stuff. So I'm like, okay, it's all just taking a little bit longer to get reopened than I thought I would, but it'll happen. And yeah, I mean, when we were in that warehouse, it was great for a while. Well, it was great. And then it kind of stopped being great. But I think maybe that was, I think maybe I thought it was less great than like most other people thought, like because I was there all the time, right? So I saw every little nitty gritty thing, and other people just walk in and they're like, oh my God, this is so cool. And I'm like, you don't understand that every time it rains, 4 feet of water come up through the floor. Like, I can't live like this. So yeah, it was fun. And we did shows and we teach classes, we taught classes. We're working now through the United Film Lab Network, which I sort of set up as like sort of a stopgap, but also is something that I've been thinking about doing for a long time. So now we have relationships with a whole bunch of different dark rooms, both in New York City and around the country, and several in Europe. I think Darkroom London is what they're called, and I think they might actually be in our network. But yeah, so now we're partnered with all these people, and with the ones in New York City, we're starting to run classes again out of those spaces instead of out of my space. And we're still doing like the drop-off film developing service, because I have little drop boxes set up where people can just leave their film, and then I check them and bring them to this lab that I'm working with. So it's like evolution and figuring out how to fit all the pieces together. But yeah, it came out of like my personal selfish need for a dark room, but also like the sort of desire for the community space and the accidental bumping into other people who were doing similar stuff, and like, you know, the sense of like, where do I go to find my people, right? Like, that was what school had always been for me. Like, I can go to this facility and there will be people there that I know I can talk to and trade ideas with, or also just not. I'll plug in my headphones and get to work, and you know, it's fine. And so that was kind of the vibe that I was trying to recreate, and I think I did for a certain degree for a certain period, and I think we'll get back there. Yeah, one of the spaces I have a lead on is with one of my friends, and it would be really, really, really perfect. So I'll know sometime in the next like month or month and a half, like when that's actually going to work out, and I'm just kind of hoping.
So what sort of space are you looking for, generally?
Empty space that can be built out. Like, I don't know. I mean, when I left, basically I'm looking for, no, I do know what I'm looking for. I'm looking for roughly 1,500 square feet that are like empty commercial space. I want a roof that doesn't leak. I want a floor that doesn't leak. I want heat. I want air conditioning. And I want like at least one decently sized window. And I want to be like relatively close to a train station in the Bushwick, Ridgewood area of Brooklyn.
I know we have quite a few listeners in the New York City area. So, you know, if you are listening and, you know, you have any leads on anything that fits the description, basically, you know, a place that doesn't leak, that has a roof that's not full of holes, and, you know,
right.
And a place that doesn't flood and can be converted and built out into a dark room, then, you know, please get in touch. Get in touch with me directly.
It's warmer than 45.
Yeah, exactly. Any heating, just any form of heating would be great. Yeah, if you're in the New York City area, David, and you're listening to this podcast, you know, and you have any leads on anything like that, or have any ideas, then, or can help out in any way, for a community project that's absolutely worthwhile, then please either get in touch with me, either, you know, through our Facebook group, or you can email me directly, or send me a message on Instagram, or whatever. Send a pigeon. Just tie a message to a pigeon and off you go. Any which way. That would be fantastic. Now let's talk a little bit about the educational aspects of that, because you mentioned that you are teaching workshops, for example. What do you find that there's an ever increasing interest in analog photography?
I would say yeah. I would say yeah. I mean, all of our classes are basically always full anytime I like tell people about them. And you know, I mean, it's a little strange because like obviously moving out of the building meant that my like numbers declined in terms of like traffic and revenue and whatever, because we didn't have the space anymore. But it's, you know, it declined, and then it sort of like stayed steady, and I can definitely like see it like picking back up. And when I talk to, you know, everybody that I know in the industry, it's like, yeah, like it's not going anywhere, you know? And so like there's been moments this summer where I've sort of been like, well, should I even bother like trying to find a new spot? And I mean, the reality is like, yeah, like I personally, like I have to bother finding a new spot. Like I have all this equipment and storage, but also like I need the space, and I think the world does need the space. space. And I think that there is and will be a demand for it. Like, I mean, we get like fucking little children, you know, we get emails from parents being like, can my 8-year-old come? And I'm like, well, yeah, I guess if it's okay with you, like, sure, you know, like it's not, as long as they don't start drinking the chemicals, it's not going to hurt them and more than it's going to hurt you or me. So,
yeah, it's just the main thing, I think. Yeah. Fantastic. But yeah, I mean, I can see how that, I can see how that's really attractive. You know, like, again, in a world where everything else around us is so digital, you know, to go back and to do something, you know, really analog is immediately attractive, I think, to a lot of people.
And just that moment of seeing the picture come up in the developer tray, like they're really anxious. I don't think there's anything in the idea in the world, you know, like they'll just watching that white paper turn into something and knowing that you did that, like, you know, and you don't have to be like a major like science and math, you know, or whatever to like understand and accomplish and appreciate like that kind of stuff. So I think there's a lot of sort of values to like, when I feel any confident.
People listen to this podcast from around the world. If somebody's listening and they're thinking, well, it might be a really good idea or a fun idea to get into film photography and into developing film at home. I know there are ways that you can develop film at home because my dad used to do it all the time. But give us a little oversight over what you would need to develop your own film, let's say in your own bathroom, for example.
I mean, super basic, like if you're not necessarily trying to actually print, you know, what a lot of people these days, I think, especially like in Brooklyn and whatnot, are doing is developing their own film in their bathroom and then scanning it like at home on their computers and then maybe like deciding from there what they want to print. Because like the equipment for printing is obviously larger and more intensive than it is for developing. But if you're developing, all you need is, you know, a tank to hold the film and a reel to load the film onto, and then the 3 chemicals and somewhere that's like safe to hang it and dry. And usually your shower is safe, clean, dry. Well, I mean, assuming you're not showering all the time. Anyway, like hang your film in your shower to dry. But yeah, all the stuff that you need, I think it can really be found on Amazon still. I know that film developing tanks and reels can be found on Amazon. B&H Photo Video is obviously, you know, standard for New York photography stuff, and I'm pretty sure they still have everything. They have cut down, everybody's sort of cutting down the number of different types of film that they are selling, because Kodak and Fuji are kind of reducing the amount of film that they're producing. But then there are a lot of other little sort of independent, smaller film brands that have been popping up over the last, like, I don't know, 5 or 10 years. So if you just like start Googling really like where to buy film, people can find stuff anywhere. And it is possible to develop color film in black and white chemicals. You just won't get a color negative. You'll just get a black and white negative. So whatever film you have, you need a tank, you need a reel, you need a dark room or a light changing bag. They make special bags that sort of look like t-shirts, but the bottom edge of the t-shirt is zipped up and then you stick your hands in. Some sort of light, tight environment to transfer the film from the original little canister into the developing tank. But yeah, and then that gets your film, you know, you do the developer, you do the stop, you do the fixer, you wash it for like 10 or 15 minutes in regular running water and hang it up, and it should be pretty good to go, like, mostly. You might get some water spots if you don't use PhotoFlow. But yeah. And then, I mean, when it comes to printing, you can make an enlarger. And so that's a giant projector thing that you'd have to find somewhere to put. But other than that, it's all the same chemicals and just like trays and stuff. And a red light.
It's much easier to develop. And it's much easier to develop black and white film compared to color film, generally speaking.
Well, I mean, it's an interesting question. Having done both, I would say kind of like yes and no, because the thing about color is instead of being 3 chemicals, it's only 2. And the development times for color film it's all like 3.5 minutes. It's not 10 minutes. Or with black and white films, it's usually around 10 minutes, but it can range from like, 6 to 18, say. With color film, the development time is all going to basically be 3.5 minutes. And you can get these press kit things. I think you can get them on Amazon. I'm pretty sure you can still get them at B&H. And they're just ready to go bags of powder that you mix with warm water, and it's ready to go. So you just mix up those chemicals, and then they have a little like pamphlet that has the instructions on how to do the developing. And you need to keep the chemicals like basically at like roughly 98 degrees Fahrenheit. So like roughly 33 degrees Celsius. But with the press kits, they're designed in such a way, they're designed for like press photographers who were doing their own stuff like out in the field back in the day. So there's a little more flexibility with the temperature. Like people get really anal about developing color film because they feel like it has to be like super consistently maintained at this one temperature within, 1/10 of a degree of precision for the entire time that it's developing. And that's just not true. Like, that's just not true. Like, if you use this press kit chemical set, then you start out at like 98 degrees, but your development time is only like fucking 3 minutes. So it's not going to cool down significantly in that amount of time. And you just have to save your chemicals. You can't pour them down the drain. You have to find a lab that will take them once they're used up. But each of those little kits is usually good for like 15 or 20 rolls. So, and it's the same, tank and reel and all that sort of stuff. The only thing that's different is the chemicals. I don't know. I don't think people should be as intimidated by color as they seem to be. It's not really actually that hard. It's just gross. The chemicals are grosser.
Right. Awesome. I might actually, it's actually a thought I've been playing with really for the last, year or so, and yeah, there might be
developing your own film at home.
I might be delving into the world of developing film at home. This could be interesting. I can feel a challenge coming on that.
Go find a press kit. Like, I'm sure you can order one online. And,
yeah, actually, I did research a little while ago. I did research like development tanks and stuff like that. And I know I can get hold of all the stuff around here. I'm also lucky that I'm just on the outskirts of London, and there's a little town a few miles away from here where there's still an actual camera store, believe it or not.
Oh, wow.
I know, crazy. But those guys, I know that, they have a lot of film experience, and I know, I think some of them actually shoot on film. So it's a little, little community there, which would be good. So yeah, it's definitely something. Yeah. It's a thought I've been playing with for a little while. So a couple of years ago, let me think, quite a few years ago, my mom sent me my grandmother's first camera from 1938, which was an Agfa Isolet.
Oh wow!
Original, like first series Isolet, and it was so it's like a barrel camera. But it still works. It's in perfect condition. It's mechanically absolutely sound. I can still get the film for it, and I'm thinking, this could be a good challenge. Why not? Yeah. So I'll just, just try it out, see what I can get with this, Now I want to ask you, how, we were talking a little bit about sort of changes in the photography industry over the last few years, especially when it comes to film. How do you see that evolve over the next decade or so? Particularly with that sort of like resurgence in analog photography.
I feel like we've seen Fuji and Kodak, they were the sort of like owners of the industry or whatever, the big guys forever, right? And it feels like over the last like 5 or so years, 10 years, probably 10 years, they have definitely, I don't think it just feels this way. I think it's true that they have, sort of stopped prioritizing their still film like industry capacity. Kodak is still making a lot of film for Hollywood, because obviously like those are such huge orders that it's like worth it for them. But like it doesn't seem like they really value, still photographers as much as they used to. So they're not doing so much like small batch stuff. And so what we're seeing is other people sort of stepping in to fill those gaps and popping up with new film brands, and just like kind of all of these just sort of like random independent purveyors who are now offering not necessarily like new films, but like very similar films packaged under a new name or whatever. And so I feel like that is kind of sort of emblematic of what we're going to see like throughout the whole industry. Like for so long, Kodak was everything, right? Like up until like the 90s, it was a Kodak moment and that was it, right? And now it's like, well, you've got your Instax, you've got your new Polaroid, you've got your old Polaroid, but then you also have all of these little like, different brands. I mean, even like Cinestill and Lomography, but also like Film Piranhas in Italy. I have a friend who's working on launching a brand called Grain. So there's a lot of like littler people that are sort of popping up to fill these gaps. And I mean, I also know like since I started the darkroom, I started the darkroom because I couldn't find one, right? And I feel like a lot of community darkrooms have popped up around the country over the last decade. So I think we're going to see more of this sort of like independent grassroots, like people coming together to get what they need on their own without depending so much on the large corporations where like the 20th century was dominated by Kodak. Now maybe the 21st century will be a little bit more about, I don't know, independent innovation. That's a weird phrase, but
it's a bit like sounds a little bit like the music industry in the mid 90s, when all of a sudden it was independent labels that sort of dethroned the big commercial labels at the time. Can you see any sort of emerging trends in analog photography that are happening at the moment?
There is something I was saying to one of my friends the other day. When I was in school, I used to shoot a lot with like harsh flash and strong shadows and high contrast, and all my teachers were like, "Lucia, this just looks like you don't know how to use a flash. Like, stop. You don't know what you're doing. Like, you're never going to get a job, whatever. And now I'm seeing that kind of photography all over the New York Times and the New Yorker magazine. And it's all people that like I either know personally or am like 1 degree removed from. And so it's like, I guess the trend would be making it look like you don't know what you're doing, even though you do know what you're doing. / maybe these people don't actually know what they're doing, and I'm not really sure. I'm not supposed to be saying that out loud. But yeah, no, I feel like I've seen a lot of like documentary work. I mean, if you think about like Daniel Arnold, that kind of low angle, harsh light, like that isn't about beautifying people. Like it's about kind of, I think about Daniel Arnold shooting the Met Gala, and I feel like his photos are like more raw, right? They're not about glamorizing. I mean, they are, obviously, because it's impossible not to glamorize an event like that. But like, I don't know, the like kind of low angle, harsh light situation is something that I have definitely seen showing up more in the last like 3 to 5 years than I did 15 years ago when I was trying to do that. But I was a child. I didn't know what I was doing.
What advice would you give emerging photographers, based on your own experiences and the lessons that you've learned in analog photography? What advice would you give like an emerging photographer who wants to give it a go and wants to try and do something different and get into analog photography? What would be like your number one bit of advice?
for someone that has never shot film before, like that's who we're talking to.
Yeah.
I would say like start with black and white and make sure that you understand the, relationship between aperture and shutter speed and film speed and the basics of how to use your flash. Like really, like there's a lot to be said for just like that very base foundation level of, actual like knowledge, right? And once you like kind of understand how to expose film, it frees you up a lot. Like it's really easy to shoot without a light meter once you actually understand how to expose film, and it will like just, I don't know, not like knowing how to use your tools, I guess, right? Like don't just like go into it and expect it to work magically and get frustrated when it doesn't work. Don't blame the lab because your first roll of film came out blank. Like you probably didn't know how to load the film, like accept and understand that like there's a lot of technical information, but also it's not that much. It's like 6 basic things. And you should, invest the time in learning the technical information about how to use the tools, as well as, don't just go out and get a fancy camera. Get something like a Pentax K1000 or a Canon AE1, something that's fully manual, and just like play around with it until you feel like it's an extension of yourself or something, like, yeah. Because I don't think it's that hard to like learn how to expose film. You just have to like do it. So yeah, just do it. But also like I encounter people who like approach me with like a certain degree of like maybe arrogance. I don't know, because they like don't necessarily know something, but they think they know something, but they like don't want to admit that they don't know something or whatever. And so then they're all like, you messed up my film for XY reason. And I'm like, well, actually, you never actually like loaded it into your camera. So sorry, I didn't have anything to do with that. But yeah, it's like put your pride and your shame aside and be like willing to ask questions and be open to like learning things from people who have more experience than you do.
It'll definitely be a learning curve, that's for sure.
Yeah, definitely. But once, I mean, it's kind of like an exponential curve, but like once you get up there, like it definitely does like, basically like plateau. There's always more to learn. But once you have that foundation, and, it's basically just a matter of like making like a few tweaks to various things for, anything, like all the developers are fundamentally the same ingredients, just like slightly different ratios or slightly different like tweaks, and you can get really into the like nitty gritty details, but you don't need to. It's as long as you like really actually do understand how to expose and develop your film, then you're good. And that's like understanding the relationship between aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, I think is the most important thing for learning how to, expose and develop film, for getting a good exposure. And also the Sunny 16 roll. I mean, that's really like, yeah.
Of course. And it's always
memorize
learning
the Sunny
something.
16 roll.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it's always learning something new can only benefit your photography as a whole. Anyway, so
yeah.
If it's something, if you're listening to this podcast and you're thinking, well, actually, I've played with the thought of shooting film, then this might just be, the little kick up the backside that you needed to make the decision, get into it. Lucia, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show. It was so much fun talking about film photography. I've learned a ton, I can tell you that. And maybe there'll be more film talk on this podcast in the not too distant future for sure. Okay, folks, that's all for today. It's been fantastic catching up with Lucia. But before we go, let me just recommend another episode that I think you'll like. Check out episode 145 with Gilbert Mayak, where we discuss street photography on film. I'm sure you love it. If you enjoy our content, consider supporting us on buymeacoffee.com to help us continue creating and bringing you more exciting episodes. It really does mean a lot to us. And for those of you who are listening to the audio version of this podcast, did you know that there's a fully fledged video version over on YouTube with plenty of examples of our guest photography in full Technicolor, or black and white, incidentally. All you have to do is go over to YouTube, search for Camera Shake Podcast, and you'll be able to watch all past episodes on there. And if you're on YouTube already, well, get in touch and leave a comment, and remember to hit that like button, ring the bell, and share with your friends. You can help us reach a greater audience all over the world. Once again, thank you for listening and watching, and I'll see you next Thursday.